In this video, I'm going to look at the possibility that there was an astronomical event that was going on at the time of the flood and might have been the cause of the flood of Noah. And that's the basic question that I'm going to ask. What I'm also going to look at is what does the Bible say about an astronomical event in the future during the return of Christ, during the day of the Lord. We're going to start off with a quote from John Morris, and he says, "There was a global flood, but the question is, what caused it to happen? The fountains of the deep were broken up, but was there an event in the solar system that led to this event?" So that's basically what the Bible has to say, is that the fountains of the deep broke up, and doesn't really talk about what might have been the cause of the flood. But with Dr. John Morris, he has the same assumptions and that I do. And Sherlock Holmes, the famous fictional detective, tells the danger of allowing assumptions to affect the way you view facts. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. So I want to admit what I have as my assumptions, and that is that there was a global flood, and the fossil record represents evidence of the flood, and most of it was laid down during the flood. And that's the assumption, but I don't start with any assumptions that there was an astronomical event inside the solar system, and that's the question that I'm going to ask. Of course, if you don't believe that assumption that there was a flood and the fossil record represents not a catastrophic event rather than billions of years, then you would never come to this conclusion. So bad assumptions lead to bad conclusions, and I think I have the right conclusion about there was a flood and the Bible is correct, but I'm going to look at the evidence for there being a solar system event during the flood. In order to use historical and forensic science to put together a past event, the detective observes carefully, collects evidence, and interviews witnesses in order to conclude what happened at the time of the crime. And this is what I did in this investigation. Investigators are trained to ask these questions: how did this happen? What caused this? Where did this come from? Why did this happen? From this process, the detective develops a hypothesis or model which attempts to explain what happened in the past based on the evidence. The past event can never be more than a hypothesis or a model. We would call it often, I have a theory of who did the murder when I was a detective, but it really isn't it's a hypothesis or a model. And when you have evolution, for example, in the past, it's not a theory, it's a model or a hypothesis, because it goes on certain assumptions and things that weren't seen, that they put together evidence. And there's always going to be some doubts when you put together a case. And that's why juries are asked to convict only beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to prove that it was reasonable that it happened, and that there are no reasonable doubts to not think that it happened. And so that's the best you can get with a past event, and that's what I'm going to lay out the evidence here right now that I think points to there being this event in the solar system. Scriptures teach that the flood was God's judgment on sinful people. Although it is possible that the judgment event of the flood was caused directly by God's hand, I propose it was caused by the removal of God's controlling hand, which resulted in general destruction on earth and in the solar system. I believe that God doesn't cause direct evil or death. That all death was a result of Satan and the sins of men. And God said David couldn't build the temple because he had too much blood on his hands. And I don't think God's ever going to have any blood on his hands, but he's going to allow things to happen. He didn't do bad things to Job. He allowed Satan to do bad things to Job. So I don't think God's hand was directly involved. Here's Dr. John Baumgartner. He comes to this conclusion. There is evidence that the catastrophic flood affected not only the Earth, but the solar system as well. This is documented in the geological record, in the numerous impacts we see in the record. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of impacts in areas where animals are buried. This is interesting. He's talking about the geological evidence, and he's a geologist, and says, it is clear there was an accelerated number of frequencies of impacts during the flood. Today, we don't have these type of impacts. We have some, but they are very small. But in the record, we see impacts that are over 10 miles wide. Today, we only see one about every 100 years. During the flood, there could have been 10 or more per day. The nearby neighbors of the Earth have evidence of impacts on Mars, Venus, and Mercury. We'll talk about that. Venus Magellan probe found that it had been entirely resurfaced with lava, Baltic rock. It also found that found about 1,000 impacts, many extinct volcanoes on Venus and Mars. So that's Dr. Baumgartner's picture of a catastrophic event that affected the solar system as well as the Earth. And he lays out pretty much the evidence that there is in the geologic record. We'll look at it more. Andrew Snelling, a geologist, research scientist, and theist, also commented, the discovery and investigations of extraterrestrial impact craters on Earth potentially opens up a whole new panorama of feasible mechanisms and processes that would satisfactorily explain how the catastrophic geological development and time frame portrayed by the biblical account of Noah's flood could have given us the geological features that we see on the Earth today. So you better understand the evidence, how it got there, and why it is there. And that's what I concluded to, and I'm showing you the modern scientists that came to the same conclusion. Here's just an example of some of the impacts. And the impacts run from southern New Jersey to northern Florida. The Carolina Bay area contains over 500,000 elliptical depressions. The sizes of these depressions range from 200 feet to over 7 miles wide. So this is just one area. This is the Carolina impact. And it has these unique, I call them round, but they're not perfectly round. They call them elliptical, but basically they're round. And people and scientists don't know how they got there today. They have all this evidence, and there's over 500,000 just in this area. It's all over the United States, so there's in Texas and Oklahoma. They're almost in every state, in every continent, these round holes. There's also the elongated elliptical holes that are obviously impact holes, where it comes down and goes into and creates a hole coming from an obvious angle. But these are different. And I think the impact craters are from impacts from meteors or comets or whatever it was. But I think these round ones are something else, and it's a bit of evidence we have to explain, and that I investigated and came up with an explanation, and I'll explain to you in just a minute. The late astronomer Tom Van Flanderen, PhD, in his book, Dark Matter, Missing Planets and New Comets, Paradox Resolved, Origins Illuminated, suggests that asteroids and comets are the result of an exploded planet. He argues that characteristics of the orbit of asteroids, particularly between Mars and Jupiter in the astral belt, show all the features of materials having been recently ejected into space. Van Flanderen made the seemingly outrageous prediction that asteroids would tend to have natural satellites. It was almost universally dismissed by astronomers. Well, good detectives don't do that. They just say that that doesn't go along with our assumptions, so we're not going to do it. Well, let's look at the evidence and see what it says. However, in more recent years, many asteroids have been found to have their own moons. In the case of asteroid Chariklo, physicist Wal Thornhorn Hill has agreed that the notion that the asteroids likely had shepherd satellites maintaining the rings asteroids have assumed that the material composed by the rings were removed from the asteroid by a violent collision. So here we have evidence of a violent collision happening in the universe, probably before Jupiter, and they show that the asteroid belt probably came from a recent collision or explosion that happened in the universe, in the solar system in particular. Planet impacts we have, and these probably were parts that fell away from the exploded planet. Mercury is covered with craters. Venus appears to have very few impacts. I talked about it, only about 1,000, and the surface has been resurfaced with lava from volcanic activity. Mars, the planet Mars, has evidence of past impacts, past volcanic activity, and past flooding on its surfaces. That's interesting. It had evidence of flooding. Basically, they found Grand Canyon there, and they assume now it must have happened rapidly, but ours possibly couldn't. And there's Grand Canyons on every continent around the world, and they assume they're all old, but the one on Mars came together quickly. Well, where did the water come from is the question that a good detective would ask. Saturn and Jupiter, the surface of the planet Jupiter and Saturn don't appear to have many visible impact sites. They are known as gas giant planets. While the surface has no water, there is evidence of water being present on several of their moons. The origin of the rings of Saturn is a mystery. I think that came from the exploded planet and the water on the moons, and there's probably water in the rings of Saturn. And I think this came from this planet that had a lot of water or was an ice planet. Uranus and Neptune, there's no evidence of impacts on either of these planets. So it probably happened inside of those planets or when those planets weren't around, if it was out that far. The moon, there's evidence of impact on the far side of the moon as compared to the near side. There are a lot of impacts on the moon, and there's also water on the moon. And they don't know how it got there, and it couldn't have been there that long. That's the thing with all the water on these planets and moons and everything in the asteroid belt. So I want to talk about my conclusion that I came with that explains the round holes that we see, and this is also evidence of the worldwide flood. The electric universe is an interesting theory, and of course it questions the paradigm of the assumptions of the astronomers, and so it's universally dismissed. But I like to investigate, and I came to the conclusion they got some very valid conclusions based on the available evidence and their explanations for how it got there and what we see going on in the universe right now and on our sun. Interesting evidence that came out just recently, a Voyager spacecraft detected an increase in density of space outside the solar system. The electric universe thinks that there's plasma outside our solar system throughout the whole universe, that the whole universe is connected. And that's a big problem for astronomers who assume that it all came together by chance, because it would take a ton of energy for there to be that kind of plasma and that amount of plasma out there, and why it's in the dark mode rather than the glowing mode. There's all kinds of problems. They'd rather just deny it. But NASA knew that there was plasma in our solar system, and they knew that that the sun, the corona, is plasma. And so they just wanted to find out how far the plasma come. They assume that it's coming from internal fusion somehow from the inside of the sun, so they wanted to see how far it went out into the solar system. So in November 2018, after an epic 41-year voyage, Voyager 2 finally crossed the boundary that marked the limit of the sun's influence in interstellar space. That was 2 years ago. But the little probe's mission isn't done yet. It's now sending home information about space beyond the solar system, and it's revealing something surprising. It wouldn't be surprising for the electric universe people. As Voyager 2 moves farther and farther from the sun, the density of space is increasing. The plasma, they don't say it, is increasing out in space rather than decreasing. It should be going down. And this is the fastest moving spacecraft that has ever been produced. It's out there about 1 billion years beyond the solar system, I'd estimate, just guesstimate. But it's a long way out there, and it's finding more increase. And it's not just in one area, as we learn. It's not the first time this density increase has been detected. Voyager 1, which entered interstellar space in 2012, detected a similar density gradation at a separate location. Voyager 2's new data shows that not only was Voyager 1's detection legit, but that the increase in density may be a large-scale feature of the very local interstellar medium. This is 19 October 2020 in spacealert.com. They're still not willing to admit the universe might be full of plasma. All the scientists before 1800s all believed it was full of ether, and that was the only explanation Isaac Newton said could explain it. I believe that the whole universe is full of plasma, this electrical conductive material, and it's the fourth state of matter. And I believe when looking at the Bible, how did it get there? God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. That would take an infinite amount of power, but it was a piece of cake for my God, the creator God of the universe. And a validation I found is that in later on in chapter 1, it says that he made the stars also, but they were made out of pre-existing material. And what do we know about stars right now? NASA tells us that 99.99% of stars are made out of plasma. So if the Bible's the Word of God and it was pre-existing material, I think the only material out there was the light, which I believe was plasma. And then he turned the glow mode off, and they can't understand why it's in the dark current mode out there, and it's because God turned it off. And so the plasma is through the whole universe. And a big problem is how it got there, and two, the speed of light through a plasma field is tens of thousand times faster than the speed of light on Earth. So that's a big problem, and a lot of problems with the distances out there if it's all based on a plasma universe. And anyway, let's look a little bit more at the electric universe. According to electric universe theory, when two heavenly bodies come in close proximity to each other, several huge bolts of electricity connect the two, and a crater is formed on both surfaces. And this has been reproduced with bodies in plasma labs, small bodies, and also they show how it works and how it creates, how these electrical bolts create these round elliptical holes. And the aerial of the boat, the crater, the mound, and these are what we see in the impressions, the impacts on Earth and on the moon. Looking at the moon, interesting here, if it was caused by a planet or object in the solar system passing by, you see the far side on the right, and that's got all these elliptical impressions, and they're all on top of each other, and they're huge. And so this tells me that the outside, there was a huge electrical connection between a passing heavenly body And because the other side is not near it, there's looks like a little bit on the bottom. Maybe it came when it was coming up, but you can see on the far side, and that appears to be electrical. And the result of a passing planet. And so that's evidence of a passing planet, and that's the way it explains how it got there. Ralph Jurgens says, I find no way to state this diplomatically, so let me be blunt. The modern astrophysical concept that ascribes the sun's energy to thermal reactions deep in the solar interior is contradicted by nearly every observable aspect of the sun. There's evidence that we see right now that goes against it, that say it isn't so. And what do the astronomers say? They say, well, we never would imagine that internal fusion would do that, rather than question the internal fusion. And the electric universe theory explains all this evidence that we see. And the only reason they came up with internal fusion is to try to find a way that the sun could be billions of years old. And they found this was the only way, but rather than following the evidence, they weren't good detectives. So the electric universe has a singular force operating in the universe. This is interesting. The electric force is the singular force. Magnetism, gravity, the nuclear force are various effects produced by charged, orbitally structured protons and electrons in response to an applied electrical force. All matter in the universe is connected by the electrical force, and since the electrical force can be either attractive or repulsive, there's a balance possible between the forces of cohesion and the forces that keep things apart. The universe is in balance. The Bible says Jesus Christ holds all things together. He's in all things. He's through all things. And I believe he uses the electrical force that he possesses. And that is him being in all things. And he talks about force, and it talks about the power of God in the Bible. And I believe the electric universe has discovered the force that God used in the universe. Another interesting conclusion came from Immanuel Velikovsky, Worlds and Collisions, the daring and original vision of Earth's history, the great scientists, prophets, revelations of cosmic drama. They burned his books when they came out in the mid-1900s. They thought he was an idiot. He predicted certain things we found in the universe, and they all came true in the solar system, and they all came true. And it's an interesting book, and basically he went through a lot of the historical legends and stories. And here's a quote from him. He says, don't be afraid to face the facts and never lose your ability to ask questions, why and how. That's what a good detective does. That's what we need to do. And he was a good detective, and he dared to face the facts and come up with a reasonable conclusion. In the book's preface, he summarized his arguments. Worlds and Collusion is a book of wars in the celestial sphere that took place in historical times. In these wars, the planet Earth participated too. The historical cosmological story of this book is based in the evidence of historical texts of many people around the globe. He goes into them. I'm going to go into some. On classical literature, on epics of the northern races, on sacred books of the people of the Orient and Occidental, on traditions and folklore of primitive peoples, on old astronomical inscriptions and carts, on archaeological finds, and also on geological and paleontological material. So he thinks there's a lot of evidence that there was a problem in the past, in worlds and collusion that they collided together. So evidence of the collision out there, the asteroid belt. Asteroid belt consists of a large number of asteroids between Mars and Jupiter. The origin of this group of asteroids is not known. Recently, astronomers have discovered a significant amount of frozen water on a large asteroid in this belt. Comets, they originally thought comets were formed when the solar system was formed. They're another mystery of our solar system. They say it came from the Oort cloud. No evidence of that, just trying to explain long ages. A comet is a small icy asteroidal body that displays a large visible tail when it comes close to the sun. Comets in ancient times were considered omens of future bad events, predictors of events such as the death of kings or coming catastrophes. The origin of this belief that comets were prophets of doom is not known. Where did this idea come from? Another piece of evidence that needs to be explained, and just one that I'm going to explain, but this is the Versoga mammoth. The evidence shows that the woolly mammoth was buried in some kind of ice in less than 30 seconds. It died from suffocation and was found in an upright position. Woolly mammoths are only in warm climates, and this was a very cold climate, so this was obviously a warm climate at the time he was buried. No digestion had occurred in the creature's stomach, and there were found undigested flowering buttercups and grasses. Bird's Eye frozen food companies ran calculations for quick freeze of woolly mammoths. They came up with the requirement that the temperature of minus 150 degrees Fahrenheit to quick freeze these large beasts with undigested food in their stomachs. So something hit it, and the only thing that cold we know of in the universe is probably comets. Here's a book. It talks about catastrophic plate tectonics, a global flood model of Earth's history. So they talk about basically catastrophic plate tectonics, and these are all famous scientists, creation scientists, and they proposed a catastrophic model, and they believe what caused it, the direct hand of God, the impact of or near miss of an astronomical object or objects was the trigger to the flood. So we'll talk a little bit about the catastrophic flood model, but they came up with the same conclusion that it could have been an astronomical object. Dr. Danny Faulkner, PhD astronomy. The other impacts on planets were collateral damage. Venus shows evidence of rapid plate movement, Mars too, why not the Earth? They believe they've come to the conclusion that there was catastrophic plate movements on the planets, Venus and Mars. And but they don't think it was here. Well, if it was all caused by the same cause, it could have very likely happened here, that there were catastrophic plate tectonic movements here. Look at some early scientists now. Sir Isaac Newton also believed the flood was caused by a comet. He believed that the comet of 1680 was the same comet that had grazed the Earth after the fall in the Garden of Eden and had returned to Earth, triggering Noah's flood in 2346 BC. That's the date that he estimated that the Great Comet of 1680. I don't know what evidence he had for this happening after the fall in the garden. That I find that interesting. He is a brilliant guy, and he did a lot of research. He also believed that the Earth is going to end in 2060. He worked on that over 2 years, studying the book of Daniel. And he believed that the 1680 comet was the one that caused the flood. Here's a picture of the 1680 comet. It was spectacular. Drawings we have, paintings from that time, show it going across the entire horizon. And comets, generally, you see them when they get near the sun, and they're visible for a few days. This comet was visible on the Earth for like 125 days. It was visible during the day. I don't believe it was a comet at all. It was something else. In 1694, Edmund Halley, after having completed extensive research into comets, concluded the flood of Genesis was a result of a near miss of Earth by a comet. He speculated that the gravitational pull of the near miss of a comet would have caused global sloshing of the oceans, resulting in the flood of Noah. He attempted to calculate the times that the comets had passed by Earth previously. The Great Comet of 1680, also known as Ker's Comet or Newton's Comet, was observed by Halley passing by the Earth in 1680. Halley determined it to be the same approximate date as Noah's flood, which he had taken to be 2342 BC. These calculations led him to come up with a theory that a comet, in fact, that very comet had caused the flood. And I believe that is a possibility. Another scientist of that era, William Winston, also believed the flood was caused by a comet. He believed the biblical account of the flood could be reconciled with science, a view he wrote about in his book, A New Theory of the Earth, written in 1696. He argued that a comet was the probable origin of the global deluge. According to Winston's theory, the causative comet did not actually hit the Earth, but made a near miss, close enough to have caused 40 days of rain from its tail. Interesting conclusion. And its gravitational pull had been sufficient to break up the Earth's crust. He believed the gravitational pull from the comet pulled up the waters from below the crust, creating the fountains of the great deep. I think he's a brilliant guy, and he came to amazing conclusions. And Winston believed that a similar event might be associated with the future day of the Lord that I'm going to talk about, described by the prophets. That will occur when Christ returns. He also thought all major changes in history were the result of comets. And that's interesting too. Another scientist who believed a comet was the cause of the Great Flood was Abraham Rockenbach. He was a well-known scholar in the chair of both Greek and mathematics departments at the University of Frankfurt. In 1602, he published a short paper in Latin titled De Cometus Trecis Novus Metis, which means an up-to-date and systematic essay on comets, which the following entry concerned the deluge. In the year of creation of the world, 1656, that's 4000 BC, 2348 BC, after Noah had attained the age of 600 years, 3 days before the death of Methuselah, a comet appeared in the constellation Pisces, was seen by the entire world as it traversed the 12 signs of the zodiac in the space of a month. On the 16th day of April, it again disappeared. After this deluge immediately followed, in which all the creatures which live on the earth, creep on the ground, were drowned, with the exception of Noah and the rest of the creatures that had gone with him into the ark. About these things is written in Genesis chapter 7. Ancient legends that include astronomical events associated with the flood. The book of Jasher is interesting. It wasn't discovered until 1683. The Bible talks about the book of Jasher and whether this is the same book that was discovered then or not, but it's an interesting book. It's available online. And there's it talks about the flood a lot, and it's pretty dramatic, of course, as all non-biblical writings tend to be. But just one quote from there that it relates to what we're talking about. And on the day, the Lord caused the whole world, earth to shake, and the sun darkened, and the fountains of the whole world raged. And the whole earth was moved violently, and the lightnings flashed, and the thunders roared, and all the fountains in the earth were broken up, such as was not known to the inhabitants ever before. It was a big problem. Harry Weiss says, a cuneiform collection of prodigies, omens, predictions, and clasps of Akka the capital of the Achaean Empire, preserved the record that many stars were falling from the sky at the time it fell. And they have it in this one around 2350 BC. Here's an example of a story from China from the book The Lost Ship of Noah in search of the Ark at Ararat. The earth was shaken to its foundations. The sky sank low towards the north. The sun, moon, and stars changed their motions. The earth fell to pieces, and waters in its bosom rushed upward with violence and overflowed the earth. Man had rebelled against the high gods, and the system of the universe was in disorder. The planets altered their courses, and the grand harmony of the universe and nature was disturbed. And this is describing, interesting, a astronomical event that affected the solar system. Another legend comes from Assam region of northern India from people known as Lushaj. They described the earth before the flood as being level, one flat plain. I believe it could have been, there wasn't the Atlantic Ocean and a lot of the smaller oceans. It was probably half the world was land and half the world was ocean before the flood. Valleys and mountains were formed after the flood, and the survivors were saved from the flood, observed as they were getting off the boat. All has changed on the earth. The flood narrative is described by the legend in this way. The earth was cracked in fissions in some places, in others it had been turned upside down and confounded by the reason of flood. Not one soul was left alive in the world. From the American continent, Algonquin Indians legend is very interesting. A star fell to the earth, the rains soon follow. Days of rain quenched the fire. Great holes burned in the earth by fire were filled, forming a great inland sea. The legend goes on to tell of the great spirit who forewarned that a star would fall on the earth. Later, the legends report an object appearing in the sky as bright as the second sun with a long, glowing tail that enveloped the earth, much like a comet. It describes burning trees, boiling lakes and rivers, and shattered rocks. After the star had climbed back into the sky, the people emerged to find their world completely changed. They saw that the giant animals had died, leaving only their bones behind. The Epic of Gilgamesh came from the first Babylonian dynasty, around 1530 BC, discovered in the palace of library of Ashurnababal at Nineveh. From the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have this flood description. The 7 judges of hell raised their torches, lighting the land with their livid flame. A stupor of despair went up to the heavens when the god of the storm turned daylight into darkness, when he smashed the land like a cup. Sumerians were an ancient civilization. It's not the Samaritans, but the Sumerians. They were from 23 through 2000 BC in the ancient Mesopotamian region located near the city of Mosul in present-day Iraq. And they wrote everything down, and they had inscriptions, and they wrote it in clay. Everybody was big into writing things down, and they recorded a lot of things, and we believe Abraham and was in part of this culture. Their recorded flood legend speaks of 2 planets as being part of the flood event. The first planet, the Sumerians call Tamat, which means the watery monster. The second planet they called Nibiru, meaning planet of crossing, which they believed to be in a long elliptical orbit around the sun. The legend reports that at the time of the flood, Nibiru traveled through the solar system on a path that crossed between Mars and Jupiter, before passing by Earth. The Sumerian legend describes Nibiru as being a comet-like planet. It describes how this planet destroyed the second planet, the watery monster Tiamat, before passing near the Earth. They reported that this close pass by Nibiru is the cause of the worldwide flood. Their writings state that the planet left behind a snow-covered Earth after passing. The writings indicate that Nibiru traveled clockwise compared to other planets in our solar system that traveled counterclockwise. How that happened, we don't know. Nibiru was described in the writings as being slightly smaller than Jupiter. It was huge, which would indicate it would have been a massive object that passed Earth at the time of the flood. The writings also described all the planets in the solar system as tilting or bowing to Nibiru as it passed. The record cites that debris from Nibiru's collision with a moon of Tiamat's collision with a moon of Nibiru was left behind, and the result in what they called the Great Band Bracelet. This is probably refers to the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. They validate that the asteroid belt came from this collision, and they see interesting witness, and that's what I look at, whether it's valid or not. And it is seems to be very thorough and very well put together, although the date that they had was not consistent with the flood of Noah, but in the Bible, but I think they might have a good description of what really happened. The Samaritan flood legend spoke of planets bowing or tilting at the time of the flood. A planet's axis is an imaginary line which runs from pole to pole around which the planet rotates. If a planet rotates with its axis perpendicular to its orbital plane around the sun, then its axial tilt would be zero, and this would be the normal way a planet would orbit a larger body, with no axial tilt. But the Earth's axial tilt is 23.4 degrees. Other planets in the solar system are tilted just as the Samaritan said. Mercury is tilted 0.03, Venus 177 degrees, it was flipped over. Mars 25%, Jupiter 3%, Saturn 26%, Uranus 97%, Neptune 28%. So this would seem to make valid the story of the Sumerians. And I think we need to look at this and see it as possible eyewitness account of the flood. A similar story comes from the Egyptians' writing called the Kolbrin Bible, contains the following record of the flood. Riding on a great black rolling cloud came the destroyer. The beast with her opened its mouth and belched forth fire and hot stones and a vile smoke. The ship was lifted by a mighty surge of water and hurled among the debris, but it was not dashed upon the mountainside because of the place where it was built. The swelling water swept up the mountaintops and filled the valleys. They did not rise like water pouring into a bowl, but came in great surging torrents. That's interesting. That's exactly what I think the model should be when we look at the flood. Not slowly rising like a flood, but just surging torrents of mudslides and water slides. The great ship came to rest on Korda, the mountains of Ashtar. This record goes on to tell the story of how the destroyer destroyed the city of Atlantis and other similar disaster stories. Another story comes from the ancient Celts, whose legend spoke of a passing planet they called the Frightener. Similar descriptions with the destroyer in Nibiru. Same story, basically. They called it the Frightener. Another Chinese story talks about an archer saving the planets from 10 suns, and they have a date on that of 2346 BC. The Babylonian Talmud The flood story contained in this Talmud attributes the flood at the time of Noah to the fall of two stars from Kema towards the earth. The statement reads, when the Holy One wanted to bring flood upon the world, he took two stars from Kema and brought a flood on the world. The explanation for Kema is given by Rashi, the medieval exegete, who is considered a rabbinical expert. He wrote that he believes Kema is describing a planet with a tail or a type of comet. This explanation found its way into the works of several Gentile theologians. At the time of the flood, a comet appeared in the sky as a twin comet. These theologians believe that two stars were controlled by the Holy One and brought the flood on the world. It also describes the world as being covered with sheets of lights. Interesting. It describes terrifying signs and commotion filling the heavens. The Holy One reversed the order of nature, the sun rising in the west and setting in the east. They're saying that the earth flipped during this flood for a while and probably flipped back again. And so this is a very possibility that other people have come to the conclusion, and we're not going to go into, but this is very, very interesting. I want to talk about George Dodwell and his conclusions. And Dodwell wrote to Professor Arthur J. Brandberg of Ohio State University, outlining his theories in the following manner. I have been making, during the last 26 years, an extensive investigation of what we know as, in astronomy, as the secular variation of the obliquity of the ecliptic. From a study of the available ancient observations of the position of the sun at solstices during the last 3,000 years, these different cultures measured it and they worshiped it as part of their religion, and they took very accurate measurements, and you're going to see that they just don't add up to the current paradigm of astronomy. I find a curve which, after allowing for all node changes, shows a typical exponential curve of the recovery of Earth's axis after a sudden change from a formerly nearly vertical position to an inclination of 26.5 degrees, which was returned to an equilibrium at the present inclination of 23.5 degrees during the interval of the succeeding 3,194 years to 1850 AD. He said that this planet was tottering back and forth. And the date of the change of the Earth's axis, 2345 BC, is none other than that of the flood recorded in the Bible. The resulting collision is that the biblical account of the flood is as a universal one, together with its story of Noah's Ark, is historically true. He validated the flood, basically, and that there was an astronomical event during the flood. He believed that the Earth underwent a catastrophic impact in 2345 that alters its axial tilt and gradually recovered by 1850. He was a devout Christian and believed that a sudden shift in Earth's axis called the flood of Noah, according to the researcher G.F. Dodwell hypothesis, was found undeniable support and confirmation from megalithic structures that contain what he had confirmed what he had arrived at. So he believed it was an impact, and a lot of people question that because it would have caused a great deal of damage. I don't believe it was an impact, but I'm not going to dismiss the measurements and the conclusion he came to that there was an event in 2345. And I don't think you throw out the evidence for one error when everything else adds up. And that is an assumption, basically. And he wasn't an expert on that and just said there was a big problem at that time. From Dodwell, the maximum and minimums were alternating at the intermediate dates of 2045. 1446, 847, and 2408 BC AD. And then after 352, 951, and 1550. Also, when the limiting lines were drawn through maximum and throughout the minimum, they converged towards the 0 point at 1850, where the principal or mean curve is also finished. So the measurements showed that it was rocking back and forth, going from 26.5 degrees to 20 degrees, basically, and it was rocking back and forth, slowly getting closer and closer to 23.5 degrees. Here's the curve right here, and what happened back in the time of the flood. It started doing that, but what happened before it was 26 degrees, whether it flipped over or whatever, but it started recovering, started getting back on its axis, and he said he called it like a top, and the top was slowly recovering and getting back on its axis, and this happened in 1850. The famous monuments of ancient times would show light on the change of the Earth's position. The Great Solar Temple of Amen-Ra at Karnak, Egypt, that's on the left. That is there. They believe that there was a time on the summer solstice. There was a hole in the top of the temple, and the pharaoh would stand in the temple, and on that day the light would come in. Only day it came in, and they said this was the god Ra, validating that he was the chosen one, basically. And the problem with that is it doesn't line up with the current movement of the sun, the tilt of the sun. But it does line up with Dodgewell. Same with the Stonehenge monument in Plain Whitsmire. This lines up, doesn't line up with the current sun, lines up where the sun was, according to Dodwell, in 350 BC when it was created, and they try to come up with other explanations, but it validates Dodwell's conclusions. Also, the Peruvian Sun Temple, also the same thing. It lines up, the time it was built was where the sun had to be when Dodwell said it was. So that's a quick look at all the evidence. I'm going to look a little bit more at the future, but let me give you what I believe. I believe that there were 2 planets in the solar system, and whether the big planet, the one the size of Jupiter, was coming through, caused the planets to tilt, and as the Sumerian story says, and I believe it caused the tilting of all the planets. It came through and was the watery planet out there circling the sun at the time. That's a possibility. The Samaritans talk about a extra planet being in the solar system before, and whether that was where that came from, I'm not sure, but I think they ran into each other right around the planet Jupiter, and there was a big explosion. I believe that started falling apart, the water giant, and the parts started forming. The asteroid belt caused the rings that we see on Saturn, and also laid a lot of water down on Mars. And water wouldn't stay there very long to form a canyon. But if there were volcanoes and there was a different atmosphere, the water could last long enough to form these canyons. So I think the planet Nibiru would go by first, crack up the deeds, cause these other things to go in, and then the parts from the watery giant would fall down after. And I believe that Nibiru went by, caused the electrical impressions on the Earth and the Moon. And when the 2 planets come by in the electric universe, they'll repulse when there's light poles, when they're both positive, but opposite attract. So when it went by, perhaps it was the positive to positive, and then the negative caused it to attract, and then it caused the Earth to flip, and maybe changed the axis tip at that time, and then the Earth was the fountains of the deep broke, which a lot of the water came from that. And I think there was a lot of water that came from the watery giant. And a lot of it was frozen and caused the ice that we saw. And I believe that the water in the ocean, it's heavy water that came from this watery giant, and all the water on the moon and different places they think are heavy water. But the ocean has a lot of heavy water in it, and they think it must have been from comet impacts over billions of years or whatever. But I think it was during the flood. And so a lot of the water came from the fountains of deep. A lot of water came from this planet. The planet went on. I think the watery giant was basically melted away by the time it hit the sun, and it pulled it out of its orbit probably. And I don't think there's going to be any other evidence in the debris for the watery giant. And the Star of Noah, Nibiru, the destroyer, whatever you call it, it's probably going to come back again someday. Another conclusion I always do, and this was an old conclusion by science during the time of Isaac Newton. Theology was called the queen of science, and it doesn't matter what you think. If it doesn't match up with the Bible, you're wrong. And that's what I conclude. When I came to my conclusion, I didn't use the Bible other than assumptions about the flood. But now I went back and looked in the Bible and see if there's any validation from the Bible. And the Bible is a historical book, not a science book. And if there's something, a conclusion in the past that you come to that is different than the Bible, then you want to look for a new conclusion. So the Bible did say that, according to Archbishop James Ussher, the Bible says the flood was around 2349 BC. That's pretty close to the dates we have, and I think that's valid date, and we can conclude that based on some of the conclusions of the eyewitnesses and the evidence. Psalm 104 is interesting. The first four verses praise God for his creation. Then in the second paragraph, 5 through 9, it speaks of the flood. In verse 5, the first verse of this paragraph, shown below, is from the NASB version, the literal translation from the Hebrew. When I read this, I came to a new conclusion. All the other translations don't say this, but this is what the original language says. He established the earth upon its foundation so that it will not totter forever and ever. Okay, the Hebrew word is mat, which means to waver or totter. The translation by the NASB indicates the earth is presently tottering, but will not continue to totter indefinitely in the future. This seems to be consistent with Dodwell's tottering earth theory. And they're right, it stopped in 1850. Another interesting thing, I'm going to look at end times a little bit, just briefly. And we know that whenever Jesus talked about the flood of Noah, it's always in context talking about his coming. And Jesus said, for as were in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. There's a lot of things talked about, birthing pains and violence and wars and rumors of wars, but also it does talk about apparently an astronomical event happening during the flood. And I mean, during the return of Christ. And this talks about it in the Old Testament passage from the book of Haggai, Haggai 2:6. This is what the Lord Almighty says, in a little while I will once more, assuming that it happened in the past, shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land, implying he has shaken the heavens and the earth in the past before, and he will again. This is talking about the day of the Lord in Haggai 2, verse 6. And he's going to shake the heavens and the earth again. Isaiah refers to the coming judgment in chapter 24, verse 18. Then it will be that he who flees the report of the disaster will fall into the pit. and he who climbs out of the pit will be caught in the snare. Or the windows above are opened, and the fountains of the earth shake. The earth is broken asunder, the earth is split through, the earth is shaken violently. The earth reels to and fro like a drunkard, it totters like a shack, for its transgressions is heavy upon it. Again, Isaiah is talking about the day of the Lord, and I think it could be like what happened during the flood, and talks about an astronomical event. Jesus himself speaks of the heavens displaying signs and heavenly bodies being shaken at his second coming in Luke 21:25 through 28. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror. There's going to be terrifying things happening. Apprehension of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. It's going to be scary. They're going to see it coming, basically. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. There's going to be a horrific event. Jesus is going to come and save the people that are redeemed, that have trusted in him as the Messiah, as their personal Savior, that he died on the cross and his sins. He's going to save them from this coming heavenly disaster. There's not going to be a worldwide flood, because God promised there wouldn't be another one, but there's going to be an astronomical solar system catastrophe happening. Mark 13, Jesus says the same thing, but so be on your guard. Go ahead and be on your guard. Go ahead and look. I've told you these things ahead of times, but in those days following distress, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. We've got to keep watching, keep looking, keep on our guard. Here's what the book of Revelation says. They talk about a lot of things, just a few things about impacts that I found in there. There's a lot of lightning and thunder and a lot of things happening on the earth, and just the impacts. The first angel sounded, hail, fire mingled with blood fell from the heavens, burned up 1/3 of the trees and all the grasses. That was a big impact. The second angel sounded, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, impact 2. The third, there was a great star called wormwood, and it poisoned the waters, impact 3. The fourth, the sun and moon went dim, effects. The fifth angel sounded, a star fell from the heavens onto earth, and smoke darkened the sun. I believe there is going to be an astronomical event at the time of Christ, and we need to be on guard. And there's nothing wrong with speculating, but don't hold it out as fact. I think once we get to heaven and we see it all, we could say, wow, we should have seen that coming. But keep watching. And one thing that I did watch, I'll talk about in a second, but another quote from 2 Peter 3. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. The present heavens that he's talking about, the one post-flood heavens, there were some before the past heavens, and now you have the present heavens, and they're reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire. The earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. But in keeping with this promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. One problem I had about the second coming and in the Bible, Jesus comes, and then there's a 75-day gap before he comes back and makes the new heaven and reconstructs the heaven and the earth. And why is that? I always wondered, why is that? It doesn't make sense. Well, maybe he allowed the destruction to happen on the earth for the people that were left behind. And it was terrifying and not something you want to go through. And Just watching, finally, this is what came up on my radar several years ago. Huge asteroid, Apophis, flies by the Earth on Friday, April 13th in 2029. Epiphysis, it's originally, the reason I got interested in it was when it first came out, the astronomer who found it wanted to give it a name, and he wasn't a Christian. He didn't know anything about it. And from some reason, he came up with the name Wormwood. And once he put the news out, people said, you got to rename it. That's from the Bible. Don't name it Wormwood. So he named it Epiphysis. And interesting, the Epiphysis is an Egyptian god. That's a Greek name for an Egyptian god. Seems pretty fair. But if you look at the Hebrew translation of Epiphysis, it means the destroyer. So that could be interesting, isn't it? How God works in mysterious ways. And April 13th, 2029, it could be before that. It could be after that. It's going to come again in the 2060s. And I think Nibiru is going to come again in the 2060s, sometime around that area. Maybe there will be a big reunion at that time. Maybe Isaac Newton was right that it's going to be in 2060s, but don't assume that. And be on watch, and it could be tomorrow. And keep trusting the Lord. Make sure you have Jesus in your heart, that you trust him as your personal Savior, that he paid the price for you on the cross, and that he is your Lord in your life, and you live for him. And so thank you for watching my YouTube video, and ask me some questions.